My first introduction to the college was the appointment as one of the charter board members. However, I had a little contact with the college before that, or at least the physical plant, and this is how it happened. I was talking to Dr. Arbuckle, and we started talking about the cannon picture in the Laker newspaper. And I said, well, that's the old cannon that used to fire a retreat every time at Fort Brady when I was stationed there. And I entered the Army in 1942, and much to my surprise, instead of going south, as most people did, I was transferred to Fort Brady and was there for about 18 months, which was very convenient for me because my home was Petoskey originally, and this was a very pleasant surprise. I even had a room in Brady Hall prior to any of the students there. But I think that's how Dr. Arbuckle suggested that we make this video. There were 8 people appointed to the Lake Superior Board in 1970, and probably my appointment came as somewhat of a surprise and probably was due to my association with Bob Davis, who was one of the legislators at that time. And there were 6 from the Upper Peninsula and 2 from the Lower Peninsula, and I think that's the most Yoopers that we ever had on the board. It changed rather quickly. Most of the replacements after that, although some of them were still from the Upper Peninsula, there were a number of Lower Peninsula people that were, and they were very capable people, and they did help the college a great deal, particularly through the associations they had down in the metropolitan area. One of them, of course, being Bruce Norris and the Norris Center. I can say that one of the fortunate things that happened was that Dr. Schuldeis was appointed as chancellor in the late 1960s. And he was a very capable leader, one of the most outstanding people I have ever been associated with. And the board appointed him in 1970 as the president. And another individual that was of considerable assistance to him, who was pretty much in the background most of the time, was Dr. John Matheson. He was secretary of the board and the assistant to Dr. Schuldeis, and I'm sure that he was an advisor in many cases to Dr. Schuldeis. To get back to a few comments about Fort Brady, I was in the public relations and security field up there. So I came in contact with a lot of civilians and so on. Most of them were very friendly. Some of them thought we ought to be in some more active military spot than the fort afforded. The old cannon was fired, as I mentioned, every afternoon. One afternoon, someone slipped a softball in it. It sat near the front gate, and when it was fired, the softball went across the parade field and almost hit the library, which was a small building on the west side over near the gymnasium. The gymnasium had been a stable at one time, and it had been converted to a gymnasium, and a small bore rifle range was in the basement of it. The interesting thing about the closure, security was very tight, and of course the locks were very important because all of the iron ore for the manufacture of war material was going through it. A lot of the iron ore, most of it was. And for some reason or other, a columnist by the name of Walter Winchell from Washington, D.C., started writing a series of articles about the country club living of the soldiers at Fort Brady, saying that they ought to be in the Pacific or Europe. And after this series were written in the spring of 1944, lo and behold, all the troops were transferred out. Another number that used to intrigue me was the number of troops up there. I've seen everything in Dr. Light's history. He says 20,000 troops passed through there. Well, they may have passed through there, but I questioned the number. The morning reports used to go through our office, and there were slightly over 8,000 troops at a peak time. And if I could name the various units that were stationed there and almost give you the numbers that were in them. But the base was, a lot of the troops were in Canada. There were a number, of course, the large barracks buildings were called 500-man barracks. And they were rather comfortable, and I had a room in one of them for quite a while, although my wife and I lived downtown in an apartment, and I spent most of my time there, at least at night. However, I did live in one of the temporary buildings, which was a squad building, and it contained 8 of us. And we had a coal stove to heat it and so on. And everybody got kind of black, and the inside of the building was black by the time spring came, you know, and this was a little more primitive living. If you were in the anti-aircraft unit, the 399th or the 399th Barrage Balloon Battalion, they were scattered all around the periphery of Sault Ste. Marie. And there was a radar site, which you probably still remember, south of town, a little ways. It was very early radar apparatus, and it had a range of only about 165 miles. So really, it wasn't. In reality, I don't think it was too effective, because an airplane could have been there before, you know, they had time to stop it. But they had to use the base. If you were in the base complement, you probably worked in an office or were a fireman or a plumber. They had engineers. They had there wasn't that much drilling, actually. We had occasional parades, usually on Saturday, but most of it was just duty, security duty. And there were a lot of guards on the locks. It was also a civilian complement of guards on the locks. But my typical day, sometimes I spent most of the time downtown talking to people. One of the interesting surveys I had was the reception of the local community to the WAC detachment, and getting opinions on what they thought of the girls and so on, which was quite varied. We had 3 of them in our office, and they were far more efficient than the men that we had as far as stenographic work was concerned. And another job that I had was typing news releases for soldiers. If they were promoted, corporal, sergeant, and so on, we sent their newspaper an article to that effect. There were many. I think probably the major one was lack of funds. I think the branch had faced that problem throughout the time that it was operating from 1946 on. And there was always a question in the mind of the legislature about whether it should remain. This same question remained up until almost 1990. One of the meetings that I remember very vividly was a meeting with Governor Milliken at his office. He had appointed a task force for the state of Michigan to evaluate the universities and colleges, and institutions of higher learning, and they came out with a recommendation that a number of the smaller colleges be closed, primarily because of a cost per student. The Lake Superior, I think, was the highest, had the highest student cost, mainly because it was small and so on. But so I would say financing was one of the big problems. I think that when it was a branch and during the early days of the college, when it became a four-year institution, equipment. I know as a branch they used to paint the walls with black paint and use them as blackboards, and until they got slate one. And the college has always had a strong biological science department. One of the things they did, which would be interesting to you, was the acquisition of the McKinnon chemistry laboratory. I think they paid $80 to McKinnon and transferred it over to Lake Superior. And but there was also a very definite shortage of classrooms. But that was pretty much one of the big projects that occurred while I was there. From 1970 to 1980, there was a building being built almost continuously, sometimes more than one. The Norris Center, of course, was the largest one, and it was around $10 million. And the Norris family made a very substantial donation, and this was Dr. Schuldeis, one of Dr. Schuldeis's expertise and methods of operating. When the legislature hesitated to give him funds, he went out and raised them privately to the point where it was almost, it was much easier to get the money from the legislators. The legislators, particularly in the local area, were always friendly and very helpful, but two that I remember very well were Rusty Hellman and Jacob Petty. Jacob Petty was the chairman of the capital outlay. I can't think of the term. He's the entire expenditure for the entire state. He was chairman of this committee. And Rusty Hellman was chairman of the capital outlay. This was the funding for all the building that went on in the state. And the two men were very helpful. And Dr. Schuldeis made it a point to be very friendly with them, too, because and whenever he could, he had them up on campus, and they were well treated when they were there. But Mitch Irwin, Pat Gagliardi, you can go right down the line, and I'm going to miss a lot of them. They were all very helpful when they were in the legislature. I mentioned some of the politicians. Some of them had been students at Lake Superior. Mitch Irwin, Pat Gagliardi, and I don't remember any of the others that were students, but both of them were student leaders too. they became very active in the campus politics, and I think that may have led them into the state activities later on. I think that the good student leadership that we had while I was there, and Paul Toit was another one that was president of the Student Senate. We had very little student activity during the Vietnam period. Some campuses were had all kinds of problems in that connection. One time they did go down, the students did go down and stop traffic across the bridge, but I think Dr. Schuldeis went down and spoke to them, and I think they returned to the campus. Tom Weiss, the chairman of your board now, was one of the student leaders there. And however, one of the things that did happen during the Vietnam period was that the branch lost the ROTC unit. One of the decisions that Dr. Schuldeis made, which the board opposed and was very unpopular with him, was as enrollment in ROTC dropped, the colonel in charge and Dr. Schuldeis wanted to subsidize each student that entered ROTC $50 a month from the general fund. And we could foresee that this would produce a lot of reaction. And eventually the ROTC did leave because of lack of enrollment. One of the other things that happened during my 10 years on the board was the formation of the faculty union. The nickname for Dr. Schuldeis was King Ken, and I think he was fully aware of it, and I think he enjoyed that nickname. But he wanted full control of everything that occurred on the campus. And sometimes this led to a little resentment. The main reason, apparently, that the faculty voted to form a union was they wanted some voice in administration. They didn't have too much under Dr. Schuldeis. And so they voted, a majority of them voted, and during the next 2 or 3 years, and I believe that the union was finally formed about 1977, they did vote to form a union and did gain some privilege in speaking about how the college was administered. But that was one of the more active things that occurred while I was there during that 1970 to 1980 period. Let's cut it again. And I think that coming to the North Country was finding faculty that were willing to come here to live, I think, was difficult. Although I think that Lake Superior had a very dedicated faculty. The people particularly that came over from Houghton Tech and put up with some very primitive conditions at first, very loyal and very capable instructors. And Dr. Schuldeis, of course, always stressed quality education, and that was one of his aims, to produce that. And being a small school with a small faculty student to faculty ratio, it probably was possible, and I think the students received a very good education there. I don't think they missed a thing. I'm very happy to see that the Native Americans in the area are stressing education, and Lake Superior, I know, has received help from them, and of course they received a great deal of help in the remodeling of the hockey rink. It was interesting. I knew Taffy Abel when I was stationed there in the Army, but I still think that Lake Superior produces some good students. I think that you can get a quality education there just like Dr. Schuldeis planned. And I'm happy to see the college growing somewhat. The enrollment did not go up as quickly as everyone thought it would. And the intent, of course, was that it would serve a community education function. But when you looked at enrollment figures when I was there, if you drew a line west from Alpena, 2/3 of the students were from a line below that point. So there were a lot of students that came north to attend.